Hello everyone, welcome to our 7th video lecture for our CDA class, and for this presentation we'll talk about discourses and representations. So we'll be talking about discourses as ways of representing and what are the ways do we see different representations of social events in text and how they're linked to the discourses that shape them. So going back to our 3 levels of abstraction, we have the ways of acting, ways of representing, and ways of being. So we had discussed about genres and grammatical moods, and so now we move to the different ways of representing, which are discourses. And then after discussing about discourses and ways of representing, we'll talk about the different styles or the ways of being for the next video lecture. And of course, as we know, these 3 levels of abstraction are based on Fairclough's CDA model. So first, let us talk about what discourses are, at least in the context of the 2nd level of abstraction by Fairclough. And of course, this is heavily borrowed as well from the idea of Foucault. So discourses are systems of meaning, ways of talking, writing, and thinking that represent how people see and construct the world. These are not just random collections of words, but reflect underlying ideologies, values, and more importantly, power relations. Foucault describes discourses are both domain of statements and regulated practices, meaning that language does not describe reality but produces it according to certain rules of what can be said, who can say it, and in what authority. In sociology, discourses are powerful because they shape what counts as truth or common sense, particularly of how we are socialized or the taken for granted things that we know about the world. For example, a medical discourse defines what health and illness is, while an economic discourse frames what growth and efficiency is as unquestioned goods. Fairclough builds on this by showing how discourses are embedded in social structures and institutions and how they reproduce or challenge power through texts, policies, and in everyday communication. So as I discussed earlier, according to Foucault, which of course is one of the pioneer sociological thinkers on discourses, discourses are domains of statements and regulated practices, right? So what can be said, who can say it, the authority that comes with what can be said or what can be written or what can be articulated, right? So, and discourses, they not only present or force upon power, but at the same time, they reify power relations and inequalities in society. And so our ability to be able to critically look at text and see what are the discourses being deployed in this text is very important because we get to explain why there are certain power relations being solidified by certain articulations, and hopefully we can sort of resist against it. And discourses are very much tied to our social positions. The way people speak and write depends on their place in society. We might be talking about the same thing, like for example, we might be talking about care, but for example, a healthcare or medical discourse about care will talk about care in the context of, let's say, health, well-being, being able to care for oneself when one is ill, or being to ensure that you care for yourself so that you do not get ill, or you as a parent have to take care of someone who is ill or someone who is having a disease. Or also care is represented in the medical or healthcare discourse as the things or as the service provided by the healthcare professionals like nurses or doctors or therapists, right? But in government discourse, alaga, kalinga sounds like it's represented as a service that is being provided by public officials, not necessarily related to health. Like when you say mapag-alaga ang iyong gobyerno, then it means that it's ready to listen to your needs, and it's able to take to attend to your needs, to respond to your needs, no, in a way that you would feel more empowered, well-being. At least, no, mainstream political discourses look at that. For sociological or activism discourse, care doesn't necessarily mean health, no, or services. Care means what can we do for our neighbors? How do we ensure that we live in solidarity with each other? How is care imagined as a form of resistance against very tumultuous situations and unequal relations in society? How do we use care to resist against power and panggigipit, no, of the elites? And then, of course, we have the wellness and advertising discourse, like using care as if you care for yourself or you care for your lady parts, you have to buy this particular vaginal douche or vaginal wash, no? Or if you care for your health, you have to, take this hundreds of supplements. Or if you take care of your loved one, you have to give them the best, and so you have to buy them this jewelry. Or as a mother, for you to become a caring mother, you only have to give the best for your child, so you have to wash the laundry using this particular washing detergent, right? And so that's how discourse works, right? Based on who's speaking, based on what you're allowed to say, based on the as what Fairclough mentioned, regulated practices and domains where those statements can be found, then that is how we interpret particularly a particular phenomenon. And so because one social reality can be represented differently across different discourse, like for example in the context of care, there is, of course, particularly in domains wherein this is very contentious, right? Discourses compete and struggle to become dominant or hegemonic. Like for example, when we talk about the idea of resilience. So for a very long time, resilience as a discourse was always looked at a traditional bayanihan perspective of Filipinos being able to band together so that they'll be able to take care of their neighbors, to look after one another, or being able to, because you are a resilient Pinoy, you can bounce back from whatever natural disaster that has plagued you. But also at the same time, we see that for in the recent years, we see that particular discourse being challenged. It's been an hegemony for a very long time, but now we're trying to challenge it because we know that that particular discourse has been used so that the ability to be able to bounce back or recoil from the damages brought about by disasters like floods or earthquakes is the accountability or the responsibility is placed on the individual Filipinos or the communities themselves. And so when you look at the human rights discourse, we argue that if our safety, if our well-being is our right, we are entitled to being safe, and we pay taxes so that the public, the government, and the agencies must keep us safe, then we don't need to expend our resilience. Instead, we have to make our communities more resilient by making sure that the public services, the public goods are channeled so that we become more resilient. We don't need to expand so much of our energies and so much of ourselves for us to be able to recoil. Or they might not need to recoil because we won't have really a full-blown disaster in the first place because there was a preemptive evacuation, or we have a better infrastructures during earthquakes, etc., etc. And so, we talk about resilience, the same social reality or the same social phenomenon, but again, when you look at it from one discourse to the next, the meaning is different, and it deploys actions, it deploys commonsensical ideas that propel action from people, propel coping strategies for people, and we also can be able eventually to criticize or resist against these hegemonic discourses, and look at it from a different vantage point, and so that we can act differently, we can place accountability where they should be placed. Yeah, so that's the goal, no? So there are a lot of discourse, there are many phenomena out there, and then these discourses, no, they take chances of being able to be the ones to define it, to be able to be the ones to create a culture out of this particular phenomenon or particular reality or particular concept, right? About how we think about it, how the population will be able to think about it. And it is not, of course, we've seen that it is not a forever thing. Like our discourses about womanhood, our discourses about manhood has changed, has regressed even. And so that's the idea of competing discourses over a common social reality or social phenomenon. So within discourses, there are different levels of abstraction. So discourses can be broad worldviews like capitalism. So how does capitalism look at care? How does capitalism look at disaster? How does capitalism look at success? And of course, individualism. How does individualism look like in terms of health? As opposed to other discourses like collectivism or solidarity or human rights, right? Or Catholicism, for example, Christianity as a broad worldview. And then there are also discourses that emerge from institutional discourses like corporate management. So for example, corporate management, probably they would have a different representation of what care looks like. So probably caring organizations would have empowered partners. Like calling your staff as partners is probably one way to deploy that corporate management of care. No, or for example, the institutional discourse of patient safety. So, if we put patient safety as a core of our discourses in terms of deploying policies in the hospital, then all of our guidelines and protocols must have a component of patient safety. And so that's the reason why when you look at corporatism or when you look at managerialism as ways of doing things, particularly in organizations, like you have your vision, your mission, your objectives, your target, your KPIs, right? Articulating this is important because you are encoding these discourses into the workflow and into the organization, and it now becomes a reality. And eventually, when it becomes habitualized, it becomes a no-brainer, a common sense to everyone. An example of this would be late capitalism, wherein we value industry hustle culture, where we value overworking, burnout, right? Hustle as desirable traits, right? But of course, we see now a lot of pushback, particularly in the last few years. We've seen pushback against burnout. Before, burnout was a badge of honor. Before, overworking, going beyond your 9 to 5 is a desirable trait, right? So, and then of course, management traits are now called as aesthetic values. Like, for example, the idea of the brand being authentic. And when we now say that you are your own brand, and so your authenticity becomes your brand. So as long as you are honest to your brand, to your authenticity, whether that authenticity is crass, whether that authenticity is petty, whether that authenticity means not being sorry for the things that you do because it's you, then it might be desirable for a lot, right? Efficiency, girl bossy is an aesthetic value. And then discourses also classify, like we have traditional discourses and progressive discourses see a thing differently. Like for example, when you talk about premarital sex, right? Traditional discourses, particularly those that are very much embedded in Catholic culture, it's still an undesirable thing to do or to engage in, as opposed to more progressive discourses wherein we are more articulate about our desires and we do not shame people for having and wanting and acting on those particular desires. And of course, related to that are your religious and secular discourses, which, these discourses are also interdiscursive with other discourses in society. Like it gets into political discourse. We see that a lot in America, in the Philippines. It's always been like that whether even if in the Constitution we have encoded that there should be separation of church and state, we see a lot of Catholicism getting into our laws of the land. And of course, more secular discourses are kind of a resistance to that. So more examples. For example, in Filipino culture, the utang na loob discourse, very specific to our culture, defines moral obligations in relationships. Loyalty and gratitude are not just emotions but become social expectations. Similarly, the resilience discourse, as I mentioned earlier, frames Filipinos as endlessly adaptable, which, as we have seen, can hide a lot of structural imbalances, inequality, and violence. And of course, we have that discourse in popular culture. We have the self-made celebrity narrative in reality shows, and influencer marketing promotes a neoliberal discourse of individual success, right? So for example, you see, what's her name? Kris Jenner, right? No. Kris Jenner, you have Kim Kardashian, right? You have Taylor Swift, for example. They are coined as self-made celebrity, or Mr. Beast, for example. No, so it highlights individual success, individualism. But we do know that Taylor Swift is actually an institution, and there are a lot of people working behind her for her to be able to get her billionaire status. And so that gives the idea that if I hustle, or if I act as if, Kim Kardashian, Mr. Beast, or Taylor Swift, then I can be the same, no? And if we hide that there's collective labor, there's also the hint of privilege that comes there, then we can just we toil and we toil, thinking that toiling gets us to billionairehood, but it doesn't happen. And then, of course, we have, for example, in healthcare, we have patient-centered or person-centered care. And this particular discourse blends humanism and managerial logic. So for a very long time, managerial logics are very much about efficiency, impersonality. But also, in the last few decades, we have had theorists saying that when you organize an organization, you also have to ensure that there is humanity there. So, but now empathy is being framed alongside efficiency, showing how moral and economic values intertwine. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, it is based on how organizations act upon it. Right? Like for example, for patient-centered care, their KPI would be high satisfaction rates, right? And so what do you do? So how do you now make that humanistic goal so objective so that you can go to you can reach that particular target, right? And so, I would say, as someone who has some engagement with the healthcare, it's a double-edged sword, right? Patient or person-centered care is really good because we empower our clients, but at the same time, putting it within managerial logics, or putting it within organizational development is really quite interesting and ironic for me. So, in CDA, what we do, aside from identifying the genre, which we have done earlier, we also identify the discourses that are found in the text. And this could be quite difficult because especially when you are starting off in your sociology program and you don't have much exposure with theorists yet looking at how discourses play out in society. So it might not be very easy for you to identify them. There are two ways that it can be done, right? It can be thematic focused or it can be perspectival. Another thing would be for your research project in general, when you do a CDA research project, it's more of one, you identify discourses that are already studied before and you see how that particular discourse is spilled into this particular text that you're analyzing. So that's one. For example, neoliberal managerialism. How do you see neoliberal managerialism, let's say, come up in texts? Like, for example, texts in, let's say, a coffee shop ad. So how does coffee shop ads deploy neoliberal managerialism? And neoliberal managerialism, there are already scholars that have sort of pointed that out. So that's one. Number two is that you enter a text and you don't know what particular discourses are deployed. Just feel it's weird. This text is weird. It sounds that it's legitimizing something. It sounds safe, but there is an eerie thing within this particular discourse. And so in that particular discourse, you try to find why it is harmful, and so what you do is you search for discourses that might explain why this particular text is harmful. So one, you have a discourse already in mind and there's a text you want to analyze it with. Number two, you have a text and then you try to look for literature and see whether there are discourses like neoliberal managerialism, Christian nationalism, red pill discourse, utang na loob discourse, etc. And how this can be viewed, no? Or number three, which is a little bit more advanced, is that you be the one to name that discourse because you haven't seen that discourse before. One example would be for the work of Nicole Corato as a prominent Filipino sociologist, and Gideon Lasco, a prominent medical anthropologist. They coined the discourse called medical populism. And this is where, when there is, this is an emerging discourse wherein political leaders make use of medical narratives or medical situation and phenomena for them to be able to pursue their populist narratives and populist agendas. So this is an example of an emerging discourse. And we see a lot of discourses sort of emerging, like, of course, quiet quitting as discourse. It came into view just very recently, right? And so within that particular larger discourse, it is built upon other smaller discourses. But now we have this very particular discourse that spills into the text in terms of how it's being described. So, yeah, so that is sort of how we look at discourses in text. So again, discourse is part of social life, like an economy, politics, or culture through a particular lens or ideology. Identifying a discourse means uncovering how a language represents, so again, representation, represents the world, the social phenomena, and not just what it describes, but how it constructs the meaning and from whose perspective. Kaninong perspektiba? Saang discourse community ito nanggagaling? And the perspective has to, is also very important because this is where you see people in privilege, those who wield power, elites, no? They are usually the ones that are sort of putting out this perspective that are unequal. But of course, there are perspectives from less malicious actors, from empowering actors, like let's say for NGOs, or rights activists, and they are trying to deploy discourses that counteract against discourses that are harmful. So from the same phenomenon, globalization may be described as economic progress in a neoliberal standpoint or a discourse. But for an anti-globalization discourse, or probably more activist discourse, it's called, or it is considered as capitalist exploitation. So as I mentioned earlier, CDA looks at two dimensions of discourses. The first one is the thematic focus. What part of the world, or what sector, or what social practice in the world is being represented, like economy, health, education, or again, a mix of both. Like for example, in medical populism, it's health and also politics, right? And then in terms of perspective, whose viewpoint or ideology shapes the representation? Like, is it elite managerial? Is this fascist political officials? Are these religious moralists? Are these grassroots activists? Or again, a mix of different perspectives. So, what are the linguistic markers of discourse? How do they present themselves in text? How do we now interrogate them? So, first is lexical choices and lexicalization. So, each discourse lexicalizes, no? Or again, no, there is a full linguistic repertoire. You have a vocabulary in your mind or in your organization's mind, and you have like a lot of options to choose to describe one thing. And your choice of word or words to describe that thing tells a lot about which discourses you're pulling them from. So for example, workers, human resources, talent, in Starbucks, for example, partners. These are all people in labor, but each comes from a distinct economic discourse, right? So for human resources, you're coming from a discourse of more organizational, traditional corporate. But when you say talent, right, it's more of a service industry. When you say workers, usually this is applied in a discourse wherein there's blue-collared work, right? Although, of course, we don't use that, no, but really service work, right? And then for partners, these are usually what we use, no, for a little more progressive. The language sort of provides, I don't know if it's a reality or sometimes it's an illusion, that the power relations between the manager and the staff, or the quote unquote the partner, is sort of is flattened because we call them partners, right? You are our partners, diba? So for example, in Starbucks, they call their baristas partners, not staff, right? Because that gives a sort of feel. And then I remember talking to engaging with a telecommunications company, and they have a very specific name for example, Ka-Globe, no, for Globe they call. So when I was doing some consultancy work with them, they would like put in their notes to help my Ka-Globe. So I was like, sino si Ka-Globe? Ka-Globe is the people who are working within Globe. And so that, and then of course I didn't have a chance to ask the reason why they were calling it Ka-Globe, but again, that sort of gives a sense of flattening the power distance between, again, the managers and the staff, and also fostering a sense of belonging. Whether that is performative, illusory, or really is, deployed in the policies and the benefits that they have, I'm pretty sure that they have a lot of benefits, because they have awards for good corporate practices, the Globe in particular. But sometimes, other organizations that just use this to kind of give an illusion or just perform. Very performative lang yung paggamit nito. Just to give na, because sir, you're partners namin kayo. So, but at the same time, those softening vocabulary choices can be used to exploit. Like for example, because you're our partners, you're supposed to like, hindi naman namin kayo, parang hindi na kayo staff dito, we're family. And so, it adds up to emotional labor pa, di ba? So, parang you have to care for each other, you have to go out at meetings, no? At pag-partner ang tawag sa'yo, you have to, like, contribute your intellectual knowledge to the company. Kasi nga, partner ka, you're not just the staff, you're our partner. And so, so, one, these linguistic markers can be really honest, right? Because it's embedded it's encoded in the informal norms of the organization or the institution. Number two, it can be performative just to give an external, like a linguistic, like pat on the back na, well, you're not just laborers or workers, you're family, you're partners. But also, the third one, which is the worst, is it can be used to exploit. No? Because you're partners, you're given to, when you're a partner of a company, then you are expected to give more. There is, right? Because you're not just any stuff, you're a partner, something like that. Next, we also look at semantic relations, no, for us to be able to see whether or not this discourse looks at a phenomenon positively or negatively. So, by the use of, alam na natin to, no, mga synonyms, hyponyms, and antonyms. So, for example, globalization may be a hyponym for progress, right? So, globalization, progress. So, ibig sabihin silang pinagtatabi. But, for example, an activist would call globalization an antonym of justice. So, globalization for them may not be the same as justice. And so, equalizing terms with terms that are more understandable sort of gives evaluation whether certain phenomena is good or not. So in that case, globalization. And then we have collocations, very similar to semantic relations, but these are patterns of word that commonly appear or co-occur together. So for example, welfare to work collocates in neoliberal discourse. Welfare to work. Whereas right to work appears in a social democratic discourse. Like, we have the right to work. So for example, welfare to work is you are privileged enough to work. Right to work is you have the right to work. Right? So these patterns signal ideological orientation. So another example would be climate change is always collocated with crisis. Climate change, crisis, climate change, crisis, climate change, crisis, climate change, challenge. And so, what image we have for climate change is that it is a crisis. It's a negative thing, which I don't disagree with, right? It really is a crisis. So, because the idea, the discourse being deployed there is that we have to worry about it, right? So, yeah, so that's an example of collocation. For example, job security. Like, there's so many things that you can pair with job, but job security is important, not just job satisfaction. Job security thing means that you have a job for a long run and that, it will be with you even something happens to you, right? Or for example, career readiness, no? So, think of the words which are usually paired with issues and challenges, like for example, mental health, challenge, mental health, problems, mental health issues. Like for example, I would usually use challenge because using mental health problems kind of puts it like problema. And for me, that's not very empowering, so I would usually say mental health problems. And so, a more advanced linguistic major would look at these collocations, no, so that they can sort of draw a clearer image, no, of the partnering words, no. And then, of course, we have the use of metaphors. Like, discourses often use metaphors to naturalize abstract ideas. For example, competition is metaphorized as a race, right? So, for example, you have the innovators, the pace setters, the trailblazer, and then you have, pag hindi ka sumasama sa competition, you're laggards. While corporations are imagined as communities with members and partners instead of employees. Again, whether or not that is just a performativity thing, or whether that really has a positive effect on the organization, is based on the organization itself. And then we have grammatical structures, like for example, depersonalization through grammar. In short, removing actors, no? So for example, nominalization, like globalization, abstract processes like globalization are nominalized to depersonalized socializations. For example, globalization leads to progress, or the care for the patients are exceptional. Pero the question is like, who provided the care? who set out globalization, who leads the globalization. Right? So it erases human agents presenting social processes as natural and inevitable. So another way is to use passive voice. Like instead of saying, our farmers work hard, no, to get coffee beans, we say hard work is the one that sourced the coffee beans, raised by hard work, or reaped through hard work. Right? Pero nawala na yung mga workers who are there, right? So yon. And then discourses do not just describe, they classify. They produce what Bourdieu calls a naturalized preconstruction, taken for granted systems of classification that shape how we think and act with our awareness. CDA exposes how this classification sustain inequality by legitimizing certain versions of the world. Like for example, you have developing and developed countries, and you already have an image of what a developed country looks like and a developing country looks like. But again, no, because of social media, we know that these aren't really stereotypical and essential categories, because we see developed countries like for example the United States that that sort of break our dreamlike idea of what developed countries are: high income, highly democratized, peaceful, technologically savvy. And you have developing countries like for example the Philippines, right? And we see that our stories and the images that we see now are not necessarily the images that was taught to us or that we were socialized in when this was first introduced to us. And then we have the productive and the dependent citizens. Like productive are the healthy 14 to 60 to 59 years old. The dependent are the very young, the very old, and those in between who may have disability, right? So those are again but we do know that there are productive young people that are not engaged in child labor. We do know that there are old people who are still productive. And then people with disability are not necessarily automatically dependent. No, they can be productive members of society as well if there are structures that sort of help them and opportunities available for them. So, but we are socialized to believe that these are preconstructions. An example would be heterosexuality as a normal thing as opposed to non-heterosexual desires and identities, right? So that's another example of a naturalized preconstruction. Parang you don't have to come out when you are heterosexual, but you have to come out when you are gay, lesbian, or bisexual, or trans, because that's against the naturalized preconstructions of the world. And as I told you, right, we see a lot of clashing discourses, discourses that aim to, take dominance over, the rules and engagements within certain knowledge systems. But also there are a lot of co-optations. Like, for example, neoliberal discourses or corporate discourses using civic society discourses like community, partnership, we like our staff, human resources, empowered. These are all neoliberal. These are all coming from civic society, rights, and activism discourses that have been co-opted, right? Girl power, girl boss, right? So these were co-opted and bastardized from feminism, and now serves neoliberal discourses. But also at the same time, we see a lot of corporate jargons, being used by civil society orgs and NGOs like project management. NGOs now have strategic goals, they have transparency measures, etc., KPIs, right? And so again, this is an example of interdiscursivity. Again, whether or not this is helpful for NGOism, which is, again, there are arguments against NGOism of society. It is based on who is looking at it and, of course, the effects that they have on society and on the people. Another sort of blending is, for example, for Gen Z culture, in online activism, we mix feminist, climate, and digital justice discourses. Hashtags like hashtag body positivity or hashtag mental health awareness show new vocabularies that resist traditional norms but still blend with consumer marketing language. O kailangan mag-post tayo at 7 a.m. or 7 p.m. so that mas makita siya. Right? Or which particular days. How do you increase the search engine optimization of this? So that's very neoliberal. Pero NGO kayo or you are an activist group, right? So again, another would be the discourse of patient empowerment. Shift the responsibility of institutions to individuals. Patients are told to manage their health instead of questioning systemic underfunding. So those things. So another other example. So for example, the theme would be OFW heroism. So the discourse would be nationalist labor discourse. So what are some lexicals we have there? So the lexicals would be bagong bayani, sacrifice, remittance. Ano yung underlying ideology? The state legitimizes labor migration as a patriotic duty. Kasi nga hero ka, so you have to bring remittance. No? So, ganon. Another would be on streaming platforms that put out consumerist discourse. Like, for example, binge-worthy, must-watch, trending now. So, what happens here is that entertainment now is framed as something that you consume as a lifestyle. So, ngayon, you consume entertainment instead of enjoy entertainment kasi nga must-watch, trending now. No? So, yon. And then we have mental health talk, therapeutic discourse. No? For example, self-care, boundaries, toxic, healing era. So, what's the underlying ideology? That emotional well-being is being seen as a personal responsibility. No? But, of course, my idea there, because it's a personal responsibility, it kind of cuts you off from community. So, I have a lot of, personally, I have a lot of critiques against the current emerging therapeutic discourse that we have, the mental health talk that we have. And then other things, like for example, collocations like bayanihan spirit, mental health awareness, right? So bayanihan is always collocated with spirit. So ibig sabihin, it is something that we should have. It's something spiritual, which is good. No, but again, how do we use it? No, in the whole of the context. Or, for example, calling nurses frontliners because they're heroic, particularly in COVID, pero after that, hindi na sila frontliners, health workers na lang sila, no, in other states or in other moments of history, right? And there are, for grammatical features, there are structures that show or hide agency. So, for example, instead of saying the government made mistakes, we say mistakes were made. Ew. Some same thing that we also see in these problematic apology videos, right? And then of course metaphors like war on drugs, the race to recovery, the healing journey. So this sort of, particularly the metaphor on war on drugs, and we've seen, and that kind of help in normalizing the violence that surrounded the drug abuse management during a particular period of time, not only in the Philippines but in other countries that used war on drugs as a metaphor for their drug campaigns. Now, looking at the text, in terms of finding, identifying, and describing the discourses that are found in a particular text, we also have to interrogate how text represents social events. In critical discourse analysis, this refers to how language describes social actions, relationships, institutions, time, and space, and how these linguistic choices reflect or reproduce power structure. So they are kind of the linguistic representations of discourse. When we study representations, we ask, who or what is being included or excluded in the text. So inclusion and exclusion. How is agency shown or hidden? Is the event described concretely, like specific people, time, place, or abstractly, general process or ideas? So did we say a specific date or time or people, or did we just say during the Reformation era? It's again a full thing, right? How are time and space used to position characters and actions, right? Texts are never neutral, they are selective in how they portray the world. Representations can serve as ideological purposes, for example, by obscuring who holds power or by naturalizing inequality. So what are the representations of social events, or what components? So of course we can represent processes like actions or events. Like, is this selected, created, implemented? The participants, who are the people or groups involved in the process, and what is the specificity of their articulation in the text, if we do articulate them at all, right? The circumstances, the when, where, and how the action happens. And then, of course, as I mentioned, inclusion and exclusion. And then, of course, we have discussed this a lot of times during the course of the videos, nominalization, turning verbs into nouns to hide agency, like restructuring instead of the government restructured. No? Our campaign, something to that effect. No? And then we have abstraction, representing events or people as general trends rather than specific actions, like economic progress or development. Next is agency, as I mentioned earlier, how responsibility is assigned or obscured, who acts and who is acted upon. And then also time and space, how texts construct timelines and spatial relations to make events appear natural, urgent, or inevitable. So for example, our overseas workers contribute to the nation's development. So what are discursive features here? So abstract nominalization of development and exclusion of labor hardships. That, overseas worker, they contribute to the nation's development, sure, but they work in very exploitative, sometimes in exploitative conditions. So the ideology here is that it hides the exploitation of the OFWs and it romanticizes labor export. And so what happens is that our institutions in the Philippines, their goal is to produce globally competent students, graduates, so that we can export them elsewhere, because this is what contributes to the nation's development. Right? For example, fans unite to support their idol's comeback. So this one is more of a concrete participatory representation, and there are active verbs. And so this one sort of puts more, not really accountability, but puts more acknowledgement in the power of the fans, to place certain idols in their privileged position where they are now. Right? So for example, cancel culture is toxic. So there's a lot of hidden meanings here. For example, there's an abstract nominalization of cancel culture, but there's a loss of agents. Sinong kinancel? Like, we just hate cancel culture as it is, no? But we forget that within that culture of canceling, there are those who cancel and there are those who are canceled, and there are reasons why people get canceled. And so what happens is that it oversimplifies digital accountability as moral panic. Although, of course, there are dark sides to cancel culture, but in the conversation that pushes against cancel culture, this is how it's being treated. We don't like cancel culture, but the point is, when you complete it, we don't like people asking accountability from people who did wrong digitally, right? So those are some things we can also think about, right? So for example, the frontliners sacrificed during the pandemic. So there's that heroic abstraction or metaphorization in a very emotional tone. And it glorifies sacrifice, and it conceals the safe working conditions and lack of support, particularly during the COVID-19. Right? And so, we praise the nurses, magpatunog tayo sa kanila, sa mga doktor, sa mga nurses, at saka sa mga hospital staff, no? But we don't question, bakit nandyan sila? Bakit ito lang yung kinikita nila, no? Why can't they go back home, no? Etc. And then, what are the ways that actors are represented? In a very subtle way that sort of deploys malicious powers. So one is generic referencing, using general terms. Like for example, nurses are caring. So it creates stereotypes and universalizes traits that nurses are caring. And so pag nakita ka ng nurse na medyo nagsungit sa'yo, how can you be like that? Nurses are supposed to be caring, right? But we forget that they have personal na pinagdadaanan, they have personal characters, they have identities of their own, they have their own boundaries and toxicities that they experience. And so, having this generic referencing may also be problematic. And then, another would be personification, assigning agency to institutions. Like, the economy demands flexibility, as if to blame an abstract identity. Another example would be, again, cancel culture. Cancel culture is toxic. So, cancel culture is an abstract entity, right? But we forget that there are actors and predicates there that needs to be interrogated as well. Why these social practices have to be a part of digital culture in the first place. Again, based on the intent of the one writing or speaking, right? Representational levels can be one, concrete, no? This can be about specific events, actors, or settings. Like for example, Dr. Santos administered the vaccine at PGH yesterday. So this is, we use concrete, particularly if we know the actor, right? So for example, si BBM ito, or it's the president or the DOH secretary, then we become very concrete, no? Intermediate, when these are generalized actions or groups, like Filipino nurses administer vaccines daily across hospitals. And then we have abstract, where the actor are processes or systems. Vaccination efforts contribute to national resilience. So again, we have to think of, sometimes it's okay to use these different representational levels, but if we see that we have to also look at, what are the discourses being deployed, if there are inequalities and injustices there, how do these texts sort of deploy them, reify them, reproduce them, make them sound legitimate. Another would be, in terms of discourse, is we recontextualize certain things, right? So we modify the context, so our ideas about them sort of also modified, no? So how are they recontextualized? By sorting discourse. So what? We interrogate present. What's included? What's excluded? What is foregrounded? Sino ang bida doon sa storya? Saang lugar ginawa? Binanggit ba yung lugar o hindi? Next is abstraction. We have mentioned this in the previous. How concrete or how generalized are the activities? Like for example, mistakes were made. Or when you say na there are problems in the government. When you say corruption is rampant in the government. Corruption is rampant in the government. Sino yung actor? Bakit walang actor doon? Right? So again, that's presence and absence. Arrangement, no? Order, causality, and timeline. Because again, for example, you just say, there was an economic decline because of the lockdowns. Like, so the lockdowns, did they naturally happen? Is it, may kulang sa order eh, like, who initiated the lockdowns? No? So next, additions, explanations, evaluations, and legitimations, right? So this includes deletion, addition, substitution, and rearrangement. So it's like we're telling the same story for a different audience. You keep some parts, cut others, add reasons or morals, and reorder events to make your point. So for example, a City Hall press release reframes a street protest as cultural celebration adds praise for unity, deletes demands, and arranges events to end with successful collaboration. For example, a magazine turns a celebrity breakup into a career rebirth arc, substituting private pain with brand evolution. I can remember, of course, very unfairly attacked, Maris Rascal, for example, Maris Racal, right? And then Gen Z culture. A TikTok recap of a congressional hearing selects dramatic clips, add captions, memes, no, and reorders for suspense, right? For example, a hospital brochure recontextualizes ICU routines as compassion journeys, abstracting staff overload while adding patients' testimonial to legitimate funding. So again, the way we narrativize, right, or recontextualize what really happened, you know, they come with motivations from the actors that are writing them, that are saying them, that are posting them, right? We have to be very critical of why they do it. Now, another way for us to be able to look at the representation, particularly of processes, participants, and circumstances. We can look at Halliday's work, in terms of looking at transitivity, argues that clauses encode processes, what happens, participants, who's involved, and circumstances, where, when, how, and why. So just we don't miss those sort of analysis that we have seen earlier. So, the processes could be material. One could be doing. There's an actor and there is a goal. And then we have mental, sensing, experiencer, and the phenomenon. We have the verbal, saying, the sayer, and what is said, the verbiage. Relational, we have the being, the carrier, and its attribute. Relational 2 is on identifying, token, and its value. And then you have the existential process, where it just says that there is. So for example, the barangay implemented a curfew. This is a material process. The actor is barangay. Versus, curfew was implemented. So it's a passive, and then agent is hidden. Right? So another, fans organized a donation drive. It's a material because you have the fans and fans as the actor, and a donation drive emerged online. So it's intransitive and the agency is blurred. Creators call out greenwashing. When you say greenwashing, ito yung you put natural or you put sort of environmental stewardship as a performative act to sort of improve your branding. Versus greenwashing was called out. It's more passive. Or nurses reported understaffing during shifts, so material and time circumstance, versus understaffing remains a concern. It becomes relational, but the agency is erased. Right? So whether or not it's transitive or intransitive, whether or not there is a circumstance, or whether it's passive or active, again, makes a sort of question or critique or interrogate what are the how the discourse sort of paints a picture of reality. And then of course we also have the representation of social actors. Again, we go back, who are included, who are excluded, and then activation and passivation, doers versus those benefiting. So again, we've discussed that earlier. Personal or impersonal actors like nurses or the workforce, right? And then do we use a pronoun or noun, or do we use name, or do we classify? Like for example, specific or generic, like Maria, the midwife, midwives, we or they or you. So these are more generic. For Van Leeuwen, these choices construct identity, power, and solidarity of we and distance they. We'll talk about we and they later, and in the use of pronouns in terms of styles and identities later. Next, we also look at the representations of time and space. So in the text, we identify time and place markers. So this is Harvey's space-time, right? So we look at verbs, tenses, adverbs, and prepositions. Ask whose space-time is represented. Are we looking at local? Are we looking at global, national, or digital space-time? Compare whether time is linear. Is it progress or cyclical, tradition or repetition? Look for how time-space structures authority, like who speaks from the timeless or the global versus who lives in the limited or the local. So, for example, global talk feels like powerful. Local talk feels lived and emotional. Right? So, changing tenses, past, present, future, changes how events feel, whether it's completed, ongoing, or still possible. When text talk about the global, like the economy is changing, versus the local, the workers in our town, they often hide who really is affected. Right? So for example, from the time of EDSA to the digital age, the Filipino spirit endures. So in this case, time is imagined as in we are still historically connected, no, to the time of EDSA. And actually, that's how we are, no, how we look at ourselves as Filipinos, that we are still very much connected to our colonial roots, no, to our roots of being exploited and then rising up to the power. That's the reason why our teleserye sounds, the meta narratives of our teleseries are, you might notice that they feel recycled, but it's because it is resonant, no, of our Filipino narrative. Diba? Inapi, kinolonize, inexploit, lumaban, stood up against colonizers, stood up against a dictator, diba? And then nagwagi. Diba? Liberation, independence, EDSA power revolution, peacetime. So that is how, as opposed to, let's say, in America, when the meta-narrative of American is that they are the heroes of the story, ba? In Marvel superhero, yung kalaban laging sa Amerika papupunta, no? Ang laki ng mundo pero laging pupunta sa Amerika. Nasa Amerika lagi yung mga superhero mo, 'di ba? So sila yung hero, no, of the story, no? So for example, we say right now everything is happening online. So it creates a presentist, hyper-connected space-time where boundaries of location collapse into digital immediacy. So that's basically how we look at digital. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Ika nga, no? So for example, since the pandemic began, hospitals have been adapting rapidly across regions. So this shows temporal progression since and spatial, local to global, highlighting transformation and coordination. That's more. And now again, no, looking at how we connect with global and the local. Syempre, we are able to, you know, when you reach out for the global and use that to legitimize whatever you're doing or saying, then that's an act of, you know, of reifying power, reproducing ideology, saying that this is what happens everywhere, so we have to do it anyway. So it says inevitability, right? Ayon. So these are the concepts that we have discussed for this video lecture, and if you are able to look at them and are able to understand them, then it's really good for you. If there are things here that you are not clear about, you can always scrub the video back and review them.